To our panel on collaboration and networks. I'm very excited for you all to come and meet with our three great panelists. Let me start off with my own introduction. My name is Nicole Esparza, and I'm moderating the panel. I'm an assistant professor here at the USC Price School of Public Policy, and I'm a faculty affiliate of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy. My research actually is very similar to what these three women do. I do networks and collaboration myself. A lot of my funding has come from foundations. They seem to be the ones that are most interested in using networks to have the potential that they have to impact communities and individuals. So let me introduce you to our panelists. This is June Holley, right? June Holley, and Gwen Walden and Pat Bowie. And why don't we just start off with each of you introducing yourselves to the group.
Okay, in order?
In whatever order.
We're going to be linear? That's right. Okay, so for about 25 years, I helped catalyze an entrepreneurship network in the Appalachian part of Ohio. So think more like West Virginia, Kentucky. And but I was also like a closet intellectual and read everything I could about networks, transformation, complexity science, and tried to use that in our work. And so 7 years ago, I decided I wanted to learn about other networks, and so I retired and started consulting all around the world with many, many different kinds of networks. And so recently I just published, if somebody has it out there, a 400-page Network Weaver handbook that's got all kinds of little, it's very, very practical that groups can use to begin a network strategy. So
Great.
My name is Gwen Walden. I'm a managing director at Arabella Advisors, which is a national philanthropic advising company. It's fun to see lots of friends in the audiences and in the audience and some new faces. I've been working in philanthropy for 26 years in Los Angeles. So I'm very familiar with the issues here, the people here, the players. I've been involved in so many collaboratives, I probably can't even count them. But today I'm going to be talking a lot about the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. There's some of these brochures in back, you can pick them up, which is a public-private collaboration devoted to early childhood issues in Los Angeles. And it's comprised of many of the foundations here, private, family, First 5 LA, as well as the LA Area Chamber of Commerce and representatives from the county who are involved in early childhood. And I'll be talking a lot about my experience with them as my client. These two are kind of the brainiacs on the panel. I would say I'm coming at it from more of a practitioner's perspective. And I'm not Beth Cantor. I thought I might wear a cowboy hat today, but they don't really look good on me. Anyway, but really thrilled to be here and have the conversation.
Hi everyone, I'm Pat Bowie, and I'm an independent consultant, and my background is actually in public health. So I have always done public health around child welfare issues, so engaged in looking at what would it actually take to create communities that supported health and well-being and prevented abuse and neglect of children. So to get to any kind of a result like that, it requires a whole lot of people getting along and aligning and coordinating. And so I've spent a lot of time, I worked for 10 years developing and running a family resource center in Highland Park here locally in LA. And in that process, decided that was an interesting strategy, a great strategy, a locally based, what now would be called the place-based strategy. It wasn't quite called place-based at that time. And then decided that the way to really go at this was at a higher level, systems level. So a lot of my work has been long-term endeavors in public-private partnerships, One of my longest endeavors has been the Magnolia Community Initiative, which is actually 500 block, 5 square mile, just north, actually, of the campus here. So I'll be talking about what does it actually take to pull and think about networks to drive towards what I call a population level change. So the goal is to actually improve the lives of the 35,000 kids in that 500 block. And if you're talking 35,000 kids, you're not talking one program at a time, right? And that takes collaboration, networks, all kinds of ways that people come together.
Great. So how we're going to do this is we're going to kind of have a conversation rather than, people standing up and giving presentations. So we thought of some kind of questions. So we thought it'd be great to just start off with some kinds of definitions of what do we mean about social networks and collaboration, because we say it all the time, yet we want to make sure that we know all the different types of networks that there are. So I think June is going to help us start out with that.
Okay, well, if you just listen to media out there, you'd think that Facebook invented social networking. But actually, social scientists have been using that term since 1920s. And when they talk about it, and I think it's important for us to look at that particular definition, they're just talking about relationships and then the patterns those sets of relationships make. And we know that sometimes when you look at those patterns, it means that communication isn't flowing. There's things that are stopping because there's this group over here and this one, and nobody's connecting them. And we know, if you want to look at this the handouts down at the bottom, Valdez Krebs, who's a really international consultant on social network, and I've worked together for maybe it's been 14 years or so. And we looked at hundreds and hundreds of social network maps and found that the ones that where people were very collaborative, innovative, effective, tended to look like this. And we called it a smart network. And what it means is that you have a core that contains lots of diversity, but also lots of trust and lots of, and that leads to, if that's well done, can lead to lots of innovation. And then the part that we often forget about is that it has a huge periphery. So this periphery, these little connections out here that maybe only one or two people have a connection to, that's where you get your innovation. That's where you connect to people in other sectors. That's where a lot of new ideas are going to come into your network from that periphery. And it's also the way that ideas are going to spread, and successes or your failures, because we can really learn with that. They're going to spread out through this periphery. So this is just an example of the way that using a map can really help you understand your network and see what it looks like. And we'll look at some a little bit later, but maybe some of the other folks can talk about their definition. Yeah.
I would actually agree. I mean, I think that that we all actually have these tools, and we have the explosion of the internet and the web, and the power of that is that we actually get to see in a visual way how we actually operate and relationally, and the power of that, right? So the whole key around the whole idea of the network is that peer-to-peer. It's not caught up in a hierarchy. It's a different kind of relationship and sharing and an exchange of ideas that doesn't get caught up in some of the structures that we've created, right? That inhibit new ideas, innovation, trying new things. So I think the resurgence, if you want to call it a resurgence, if it's, of this power of the networks has been because we live it in a different way, right? We have these smartphones, the internet, we see the web, we see, what Wikipedia, what can happen when you just let people loose to self-organize and create, and that things actually really can happen with that. So I think it's a renewed interest and a new exploration with new tools to actually see how things happen, whether we're intentionally having that happen or not.
And the thing we're realizing is you need a lot less organization than you think. If you really use the tools, social media tools, if you really understand this thing called self-organizing, which just means helping people with similar kind of interests get together and do something, usually small, that your organizational needs are less. Because organizations are wonderful, but they're also very expensive. They have overhead, and they also tend to dampen down innovation. And that's part of our problem, is that we really need breakthroughs, and we really need to be madly experimenting and trying things out. And so we're just finding, I mean, people still create these things they call, we're going to have this X network. And then they bring in a coordinator, and they start to try to get everybody to agree on things. And sometimes that's fine, and sometimes that begins to move it toward being an organization, and it starts losing some of the benefits of being a network. And so now, especially like if you look at food systems, alternative local food systems, there's no network, there's no big, what I call big N network there. It's just people figuring out what's needed in their community, getting together, starting a farmer's market, starting community gardens, whatever. And as long as they are interacting and communicating about what they're learning and what's needed next, you can get tremendous change that's happening in those communities. And I just think some other sectors might look at that for more of a model to see the power of what self-organizing can be.
I guess I'd like to just add that one thing that it is not is technology.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think when we use the shorthand of networks or social networks, everybody thinks about technology or a website or something like that. And to me, that's a tool for a network. It's not the network itself. And I think it's important for us always, especially in a venue like this, to realize the importance of the eyeball-to-eyeball relationship building. Networks are relationship builders, and in a complex of relationships. And a lot of that has to happen person to person, not computer to computer.
I would say that from the public sector side and the private investment side, in the 90s when everything had to be collaboration, right? Like we've decided, nobody can do it alone. You always got to do it with other people. 5 is better than 2, and it was really pushing people to organize and develop. And sometimes that worked really well, right? Sometimes it was pushing people to have different kinds of relationships and build trust and drive to change. But a lot of what we also did was add a whole nother level of complexity in the multitude of ways that people had to collaborate. I just actually, there's about 70 partners in this initiative in Magnolia. And I just sat down over the holidays and thought about and wrote down every initiative I could think of that was going on and that they were involved in just that 500 blocks. And it came out to be about 26 initiatives, right? And then I drew lines so I guess I am a little geeky on this part of it. And this is why the technology does help you. You can actually draw lines really quickly. And you just see wow, how does anyone get anything done, right? It's like there's multiple players, right? And so I do think we have to think about how we structure and how we fund. And every time we think about starting something new, we never seem to ask, well, who's your natural partners already? We always seem to say, well, you need to pull in X, Y, and Z partners, and it's not good enough unless you have them, and them. And I think it's time we really think about that and really think about the way that folks have invested in building those relationships. How are they trying to drive to change? What would be a meaningful result? Everyone's feeling the pressure of going beyond program results and really getting to this kind of civic result, well-being, whatever we want to call it. And that really does require rethinking how we align and how we coordinate. But that organization does require some investment. We're just not sure exactly what is the best investment to drive that change. I mean, I would put that out, that I'm not sure we know what is the perfect network, how would you best and perfectly invest in it, right?
Right. So there's a couple things that I'm hearing here is, sometimes there's organic kind of bottom-up networks that just people just create on their own. And then sometimes there's kind of service provider networks, which are kind of top-down. They're going to create the network for you and find partners. And so they're kind of two different ways to think about. And the crazy thing is we all live in multiple arrangements such as this,
that,
right?
yeah.
So you have, my boss on Facebook and, my mom, which is never, worlds are going to collide, right? But so one of the things I wanted to ask about is, why networks and collaboration is so big today. Is it new? Is it not new? Why has it become resonant now? And I want to hear from Gwen talking about it from, why is it big in philanthropy?
Yeah, I think, we've always been, in philanthropy, we've always talked about collaboration. I mean, it's always been one of the watchwords, and it's something we always made our grantees do. We didn't do it very well ourselves, but we made them do it because it had to be a good thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And, I think the real game changer has been, and why lately it's become sort of much more of a watchword, collective impact, for instance. We used to call that collaboration. Now it's called collective impact. And I think, though, that the notion there and what has changed it is this accountability to impact, which, when I first started my career in philanthropy, we never talked about impact at all. We gave the grant and we moved on to the next due diligence on the next grant. We didn't really talk about what impact that grant had or what impact a cohort of grantees had or, any long-term kind of strategy or planning per se like we do now. And I think that the whole drive to sort of do more evaluation, become more thoughtful about impact, and see results has forced us to think about, well, what does it take to make those kinds of changes that we're holding ourselves accountable to? And what it takes is real leverage and real collaboration, because there are very few issues, I think, that we deal with in the social sector, whether it's homelessness or early childhood or graduation rates, climate change. There are very few issues that we deal with in this world that are solvable by our own means. We must collaborate in order to achieve those changes in almost every instance. I can't think of very many where we can't, where it won't. So, I think that's been kind of one of the big game changers. And the economic downturn kind of just added to that, because I think we did kind of cross the Rubicon in a way. I don't think we're going back to the way that it was, and I think that never in my life, actually, and as I said, I've been in this field for a long time, before this last economic downturn, I did not really experience foundations laying people off. It used to be sort of a full employment act to work at a foundation. And it's changed. The environment we work in has changed. The way we do our work, our practice has changed. And the importance of collaboration now in a world of reduced resources, but very high expectations for getting the kind of change we want, I think has made collaboration, and not just among funders. I think we have to think about the public-private collaboration. We have to work with our colleagues in the public sector. We have to work with the business community, because the issues that we're dealing with are affecting all of us. They're intractable, they're long-term, they're generational work, and they require that kind of collaboration. So I think that's why we're experiencing this now. There is a little bit of sort of, philanthropic sort of trendiness to it. I mean, I'll just admit to that. I think the fact that we're talking about social networks and philanthropy and stuff, instead of just saying how do we collaborate better, I think and we love in philanthropy to sort of seize on to those kinds of buzzwords and stuff, and I think there is a certain amount of that going on in this, but this is one of those times when I believe also that it's not just a trend in philanthropy. It's actually something that if we want to achieve our goals and our missions and our purposes, we're actually going to have to make that a part of our practice if we're not already.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then, Pat, you're mentioning about the service nonprofit side of it, which is getting a new, every time you apply for a new grant, you have new partners, and so I want to see you talk a little bit about that in your experience. At
Well,
Magnolia
and I
Place.
think it's echoing, everyone is feeling that same change and that same pressure, whether, it's the service sector, whether it's the public sector, nonprofit, service sector, the, public sector, philanthropy. Everyone is, the world is shifted, right, in terms of what do we actually know needs to happen. The problems are more complex and more entrenched, and it's not getting better in the way that we're going about it. So the instinct is, and the knowledge that is, no one can do it alone, so more is better. So that push around collaboration is like, the biggest push was really in the 90s all the way through, and this is just, we're kind of moving to an understanding of it might be self-organizing, it might not be so structured, but it's still got to be everybody together doing better to get better results, because people are not going to get there on their own, right? And in a time of diminishing resources, right? Everybody, like, can we be more efficient? Can we align and coordinate? There's a lot of pressure on the service sector. Don't duplicate, right? Who else is doing it? How do you partner with them? Doesn't matter if you really had not talked to that organization because you had a fight 20 years ago, but it's all right. You're going to do better now, or you're going to get over that history that you've been competing for the same dollars in the same community for a whole long time, and now you're going to be best buds, and you're going to work it out, and you're going to be aligned and coordinated, and you're going to do it with less dollars, and you're going to get better results. So there's a lot of pressure about what does it actually then mean, and what is the environment that needs to be fostered and created, right? And that is where the power of aligning towards this notion of, peer-to-peer learning and sharing. Can we create a new environment? Can it be about innovation? Can we create different relationships among ourselves? I mean, this is where I think the language of community of practice is taken up and resonant. It's reminding people, well, why did you come into this field? What did you actually care about? What do you actually want to achieve? What do you do with this new information that's out there now? And what are the structures that are going to help you explore that and do that? But I dare say most folks still don't want to pay for that aspect of the work, but it's the critical piece of learning, and it's a critical piece of changing from the old way we've organized and done our work to what potentially we need to get to, that's where innovation comes from.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore that, because I think one of the major tensions for funders around collaboratives is that they take time to develop. It takes investment in the collaborative itself in order to make it successful, and it takes time. But then you have this pressure to show results, and you want accountability to impact, and that's why you're doing the collaborative. And the patience and money that it takes to get to that place is not, I would say, our strong suit, or it hasn't been historically. And so there's this, just this great tension about feeling that pressure of, well, we're doing this because we want to have impact, but then we're going to spend 2 years talking to each other before we actually even do anything or fund anything together. And that has been actually one of, I think, the partnership that I'm involved with. It started just as a learning community. We're just going to get together and talk to each other, and hopefully by learning more about each other and what we're investing in, we'll make better investment decisions ourselves. And just started that way, no pressure. It was not a donor collaborative when it started. It's turned into one now, sort of 5-7 years on. But that kind of patience and investment in what makes a successful collaborative, and we know what makes successful collaboratives, we know what those components are, but having the patience and just the tolerance for that amongst ourselves, I think, is one of the hardest things.
Yeah. And there's just so much more possible now, too. And so I think this is maybe a little bit more positive take. I mean, there's like young people out there that know how to use Indiegogo. I mean, they don't even need the funders anymore. They can get their money themselves. And believe me, they are. I mean, I just know so many projects that are raising quite a bit of money, but they're doing small projects. The mapping technology, being able to see your network, it's really liberating, and you can track it over time and see whether it's different. And even though the technology isn't what it's all about, I mean, being able to use like Google Hangouts and have 15 people's faces there for your project, and being able to see each other eyeball to eyeball, but still virtually, you know, that's the fabulous kind of stuff. We're learning about innovation funds that give small kind of seed funding. We're learning about this whole thing of network leadership and that it's different and that there's a different skill set. But those kinds of things also, they need, you know, they need to be supported. The more that's invested in that kind of stuff in learning. I mean, I just think the learning and deep reflection is like one area where we just have a really long, I mean, people are making breakthroughs out there that you're funding all the time. They're making breakthroughs, and guess what? Their to-do list is so huge that they don't even have time to see that they're making those breakthroughs, and then nobody else is going to gain the benefit. I mean, our work could escalate incredibly if we said it is really important to take the time to not be so busy, to really look at what you're doing and make sense of it. And that's what's going to enable you to take the next step in a lot smarter way.
So one of the things I want to ask the panelists here is this idea of sustaining networks. You're saying that they come together and they go apart, and Gwen was talking about investing in them, and I know that June talks a lot about could be using technology or having particular people that help bring it together. And for me, one big example, I think I've talked with you about this before, is one of my co-authors is, he's on one of the advisors to MoveOn.org. And one of those things was that they had all these people, they came together, when a crisis occurred, they got on MoveOn.org and they signed petitions, and then they all just disband. And then they came together later, and then they all just disband. And they go to, and so my co-author, Paul Lichterman in sociology here, is a social movement scholar and social movement activist. So now they have meetups in each area so that people can create networks, and networks that are not just built on one particular activity, right? Mm-hmm. And people have said, you know, part of the issue is that we have some people in, like say, the Republican Party. They always were able to mobilize quickly because they saw each other at church, or they saw each other all the time. They had other reasons to intertwine rather than just for political mobilization. Whereas the people at MoveOn.org, the left, part of their strategy was just, we're not going to really have that many connections to each other, only ones that involve us moving together. And I think a lot of you are saying the similar things, that that networks are more than just these service groups or just this. And so I wanted to hear maybe from Pat a little bit on.
Well, I think, I mean, what I would say to that is that it depends what the purpose is, right? So, you know, it's no different than form follows function, right? If the purpose is to activate a network to actually move quickly and respond to crises, then MoveOn had a great strategy for that. But if the effort is something a little bit different, like the whole structure in around networks, if it's you know, those close by form a tie, right? That's a critical juncture for us. For our own social and emotional well-being. We need those close connections. We all need that. But from information, to get ahead, it's those looser networks, right? So it's those looser ties that are actually much more critical. So some of it is thinking about what are you building for what purposes, you know, and being intentional about that. And there's a lot of work around that, both in looking at political movements. That's Christakis and Fowler's work, right? The book Connected that they did, and they were able to demonstrate, you know, if it's about information, you know, that can spread really quickly around loose ties. But if it's actually getting to a behavior change, that's about your close network. So in thinking about even funding, what's the intentionality that you're trying to drive? What's the impact are you trying to get? Are you in a spread mode and you want information? Then it's a looser tie kind of a strategy versus are you actually trying to get parents to read to their kids daily? Well, that's a tighter, what is the network? What is the social fabric? How do you actually communicate within and change that kind of behavior? That's got to come from a trusted intermediary that's already part of embedded in that social network of that family or that community. So I think the challenge with networks is there's no right or wrong there's no perfect network. It's what are we trying to do, and what is the strategies and structures that are most meaningful that would actually do that, and you would support those differently, right? And you would support those strategies differently.
Yeah, I think, from a funder's perspective, you don't get to skip the strategy step. So it's sort of, you still have to know what your purpose is, what's your goal, and how is the formation or the joining or the supporting of a network or a collaborative going to be a tactic to achieve that goal, right? And I also want to pick up on something you said around movements. Right now it seems really quaint to talk about movement building, because it seems kind of slow and maybe a little old school in the context of social networks and Indiegogo and all that. But I think one of the great contributions of especially the technology around networks has been around movement building, and how that's become sort of, we used to call it community organizing, right? That seems kind of quaint now too, but it's sort of a really powerful and important tool for movement building. You still have to have all the other components of movement building, but from my perspective, to me, that's where it's really exciting to watch these different networks interact around different issues and at different times in service to a larger purpose or a larger movement. And I think that's that's where these coming together and coming apart and coming together and coming apart, I think is an extremely powerful kind of mechanism for pushing a movement forward.
Yeah.
Do you know what's it? Here, I'll go next. Okay. So I know, Pat, you just spoke, but we'll ask you another question. So in Magnolia Place, I like to talk about how you're trying to build networks within. So you have both the service provider networks, but then you also have the community and how you're trying to build and strengthen the ties between the community.
Yeah. Because the intentionality is how do we actually drive to that population level change, right? How do you actually improve the lives of 35,000 kids in that? And that, so as much as, in the talk earlier was, well, money is necessary, but not the answer. Well, the mantra for the network partners is services are necessary, but they're certainly not sufficient to get to that level of change. And they're not sufficient to get to community level change. So what then would need to happen, and how and what is the role of actually services in creating and supporting neighborhoods, neighborhood networks, the existing fabric that is part of community life. So in part of that is really going out and identifying where are the community groups, where are people already organizing, what already are the communication networks, and we get support from USC on that through the Annenberg School Metamorphosis Project, Tom Valente, his work in the public health. I mean, they're the ones that actually trained us, Tom Valente, and how you actually do the mapping, how you actually identify. So it's also a partnership with those folks who have the resources and expertise to help you move that forward and understand that better, right? So I think, I think part of it is helping even service providers be a part of a larger learning. What we now call Magnolia is a learning system. And what we actually ask of the partners to say, we know you do your thing, and we even say this to neighborhood members, like, we know you know your neighborhood, but why don't you care about your kids and your family, but what about the whole neighborhood? Do you care about those kids and families too? And they're, of course we do. It's like, well, okay then what would it actually take for us to be more neighborly, for us to actually know our neighbors? What would it actually mean to create that engaged environment? And in the same way, it's creating a parallel change learning process, and then building relationships among and between organizations, and among and between neighborhood residents to community groups to organizations. And it's looking at it like a movement, like you would do organizing in that way. And having people have a shared goal, having people have a shared measurement system, shared metrics that they look at and share with community members as well. We give maps to the community members. We are able to map how well kids are doing, 0 to 5, in their neighborhoods, and we bring that map back and show that to neighborhood residents and say, this is what you could be talking to your neighbors about. Why do you think that is? Why are kids in this neighborhood actually doing really well around a health measure, and you're right next door and you're not doing so well? Why do you think that might be? What's going on? Or, it's creating a different, it's arming people with the information that's going to engage in their passion, that's going to ask them to connect and say, we create safety in our own neighborhood. We create neighborliness. We create well-being. We don't wait for it outside. In the same way, it's asking service providers, you play a role, but you've got to step beyond your role. If we're really going to get to the civic result, it isn't just about your service. It's about getting deeper and connecting in a deeper way and connecting people to one another. I don't know if that.
So one of the best predictors of how a newborn is going to do later in life is the zip code that they're born into. So,
That's right.
right. So any zip code around Magnolia Place, a newborn who is living there right now is likely to not get a good job, not graduate from high school,
That's right.
to have diabetes or be obese. It's very predictive. And what all the research is showing is that what's missing in a Magnolia Place zip code versus, say, a San Marino zip code or a Rancho Palos Verdes zip code is this blending and braiding of the social fabric. It's everything from having soccer fields where you can actually feel safe enough to go and play there, to having a good transportation system that will take you to school, to having
A good school.
having a good school. So it's all that social capital that we deal with every day in our work, connected, blended, braided, providing this wonderful kind of environment, nurturing environment where that newborn can grow up. That's the difference. And that's exactly what we're talking about, which it's not a new idea. It's not a new social network. It's something that I think we've instinctively known for a long time, but I think the social network kind of phrase, the catchword, the illustrations of it, I think is just allowing us to put some words and pictures to it that maybe we didn't have before, and make it just live in a place like Magnolia Place, where you're getting great results.
And the whole reconceptualization of leadership as network leadership, or what we call network weaver, is really different too, because then it's not like, oh, you've got to get everybody behind you and you stand in front and be a big person. But the idea, it's more maybe womanly or whatever. Oh, I'm gonna connect you to this person because I know she's going to school at the same place, and let's help each other out. And so it's this idea of not only connecting and seeking out and being more inclusive, but the number one role of a network weaver is to help other people become these network leaders too. And so it's very viral that way. And I think that it's slightly different than like a community It's maybe not as big as a community organizer. It's like you can be it on any level. And so just imagine mobilizing, all these moms out in these neighborhoods just to do a little bit more connecting, and then helping people, catalyzing these small actions. And I think that's the kind of thing that then people learn skills, they build trust in that, I call them 2Zs or 3Zs or whatever. And they build skills there that then some of them are going to be interested in doing a little bit bigger projects. And I think it's when we see our communities having thousands of these little projects that then the next layer can be bigger. That's what's going to lead to the transformation
And it's
we're
kind of
call
where
that,
it's kind of where our practice, needs to rethink itself a little bit, because, that mom is not a 501c3 organization. It's like, well, how do we support that endeavor that we know is so important to reaching the outcomes that we want to reach for these kids or for anybody? And that's
and sometimes money isn't even helpful.
right, and money is not the thing
right?
that's needed, right?
But
In fact, it could be harmful.
right.
Yeah.
No, we
But support and
protective
coaching
factors is the other big push, right? And
The what?
Protective factors, right? And those are the things that are present that we know if these protective factors are present, kids and families are better off. So it's very big in the health arena, the child welfare arena, the notion, and because there's research based around these protective factors. And so what we actually do is we call these neighborhood folks protective factors. So we were like, you are the protective factor for your community. And then we call them neighborhood ambassadors. We ask them to come, and we come to a community breakfast and just to thank them for being a protective factor in the community. Right? Because it's not asking them to now be organizing for another purpose. It's like, no, you know what? You being that person that calls the police every day around the concerns that you have, that's work. And we just want to acknowledge that that's huge. The neighborhood already knows you do that for them. They love that they know you're tired. And we want to actually thank you, and so did that. It's kind of recognizing the normalcy of what goes on in daily life, but bringing some intentionality to say that's actually a huge piece of that neighborhood effect, creating safe environments for kids and families. That doesn't happen by police showing up. That happens by neighbors actually maintaining kind of a culture of safety and caring. And so it is thinking about it different. Like what does it do what do you do to bring intentionality to that, and do we ruin it by bringing intentionality to that? We don't really know, right? That's the part we're not really sure. That's part of the innovation and the testing that should and could go on if we're really going to get to a change in why zip code actually matters for one's health or not.
So I want to ask June to talk a little bit about network weaving, which is kind of similar to, and I know you guys have spoken before. So how is network weaving different from just say networking? I like that you wrote that in the thing.
Right. So
I don't consider myself a networker. I guess I try to more be the network weaver.
yes, because the difference is who is it for? When you're networking, it's all about here, get the business cards. I want, more connections so my work or whatever benefits. And I think a network weaver understands complex reciprocity. So it's like, if I make this whole network better, it's going to be better for everybody in it, but it's also going to be better for me. But I might give you something. I don't expect you to give something back to me, but I expect you to give and share with others in the network. And so then you create this thing that's way beyond, it has so much more resource. I mean, we're always saying resource poor, but there's so much resource in terms of skills, in terms of being these protective, I love that, helping each other out. There's so much more out there that we're not tapping into. And the idea of the network weaver is just that people, they take that little network weaver checklist that we passed out, and sometimes I just pass that out and have people take it, and they mark 1 to 5, which am I strong in, which am I not that great in, which would I like to learn, and always you'll have in a room people saying, oh, I'm a network weaver. I've been a network weaver all my life. I didn't know that's what I was doing. And now I feel really, it's that validation, like when you gave that name too. And so people take this and then they add things that are listed on that checklist. They start, I never asked people what their dreams are. I never thought of that. One of my friends said, who took that. And she said, now I ask everybody, what's your dream? What do you really care about? And she said, oh, their faces light up, and all of a sudden, there's just a lot more energy there. And so, I don't even give lectures on these roles. Just hand this thing out. People, and it's on the internet. You can get it, use it however you want. And it's this then the idea that there are several roles that you can play in a network, and this is just trying to capture some of them. And then people can get better at them. Once they have the word, they can get better because they are doing it naturally, but they can be 10 times better. And that's where I think, helping, and network weavers don't get better from training. They get better from peer assists and coaching. So in other words, so you've got to think, how do you support network weavers? After, yes, they have to learn maybe a few new little terms or something like that, but mainly it's this community of practice, where they're going out and trying something, coming back and saying, well, I did this, but and somebody else will say, oh, yeah, I had that experience, and here's some things that I learned from doing that. And so they can begin to become more skilled helping each other.
So a lot of it's, introducing people to other people rather than, just introducing yourself to somebody.
Right,
But
right.
it's like, I don't want to introduce you to my friend because you might like my friend better than me, so I will not do which is kind of some of the issues with, this is my funder, I'm not going to introduce you to them.
scarcity.
Yeah, the
of
scarcity
this.
model. Yeah.
Right.
And it's a new way of thinking it in, that it would be better for everybody if we said, you know what, you do similar things. You guys should actually meet each other. And for me, there's certain people in my life that do that for me all the time. And I do it for them, but I don't necessarily email people out of the blue and say, hey, this is me, this is what I do, we do similar things. And I think that's important and thing to note.
I want to hear what these guys have to
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
We're here now for the...
I think one of the challenges in looking at Magnolia, also in particular for funders, is that the impact or the results may look different. And Gwen alluded to the fact that they may take longer. Obviously, that's sort of the easy, obvious one. But even looking at what you're talking about in terms of, and what you're talking about in terms of moms, Magnolia has this great sort of mommy and me model where they know they can't serve every single mom in the community, but what they do is they bring parents in, and the moms do spend time with the kids and with other moms. It creates social connectedness, and it gives them socialization, and it teaches them parenting skills, but more importantly, it then empowers them and actually challenges them to go into their communities and share that with other moms, right? So that's the spread effect, the ripple effect. But imagine, Magnolia trying to tell funders how to measure, or how they're going to measure what that looks like. And I think they're making efforts to do that, but it just requires, I think, funders to really rethink what they're asking of these types of efforts to try to start to show that type of impact, because it's not just number of people served or number of hours in a classroom anymore, right? So it is, I think, dramatically different, and all of us are trying to learn as we go.
That might, interestingly, you raised that. I was asked actually a month ago to talk to a group of funders, and this was up in Seattle. Casey Family Programs put this together. They're launching their communities of hope, right? And so what they did is they asked some folks and researchers and to actually expose them to how are you at what. Magnolia has this dashboard, and most people who see it just absolutely gloss over, and it's not a good PR piece. I guarantee you, it's really not that. But it's a different way that we have to capture data. It's a different way that you're introducing. So those funders were just like, you're going to have to spend just a little more time with us and just explain to us what the heck are those things, right? And why? Where did you get them? And why do you measure in this way? And what can you actually say about that? And so I think you're right, folks. You can't go at this with an old frame of here's how you're going to get a traditional outcome. It doesn't mean you can't demonstrate impact. Businesses have used this kind of data collection for a long time. We just are pretty new to it in the social sector and in the public sector. But it is looking at data in a different way. It's asking impact. What is impact? How do you show it? And it could take a long time. So what do you expect to see along the way? What are the benchmarks?
And there's a lot of people working on network evaluation. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation on that, and in the near future, because there's indicators that you can track as well as the outcomes, and so we're trying to get some of that stuff together.
I think there's some people over here. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
That'd be great.
I'm Sharon Vincent. I'm from the Jewish Community Foundation in San Diego. And I was just thinking that, what always strikes me, and I feel like as funders, we run the risk of these sort of underfunded mandates. Colin, you were talking about collaborate, when really the capacity is stretched so thin, just trying to get the good work done. And so I just wonder if you guys had any thoughts about, using as sort of a capacity building grant, giving nonprofits, funding them to not for an outcome for a collaborate, but paying for their time to meet. Because I just feel like they take it on the chin, and there's a little bit of resentment. There's the turf issues, and even in trying to say, there's enough good work for everybody, but yeah, there is, but is there enough good money to go around for everybody? So I just wonder what you think about. We've had some collaborative stuff in San Diego where we've actually paid nonprofits to just come together, paying for their time without necessarily. So.
Yeah, you go first.
Well, I think, that it's a good impulse as long as there's a purpose to it. Adding one more meeting to people's plates is not kind of that fun. But it is important for them to share stories and talk to each other. And if they can do it in a way that's facilitated and purposeful and somehow goes towards them achieving their goals or their purpose or their mission, I think it's a great thing to do because they don't get support to do that. But if it's just for the sake of kind of getting together and going to another meeting, then obviously it's not that much fun, and it's just another thing they do to please us, as funders.
I think you hit on it too, and and this is for all of us, right? If for learning to occur, there has to be a little bit of vulnerability there, right? Which means that the environment's got to be one that people are in a place that it's okay for them to say what's not working, and right. So it's great to have a meeting, but to have that worthwhile and to create that space does take some thought about that. Is it an invitation to learn? Is that a space that's created trust for learning? Maybe I'm talking a little out of turn here, but Department of Children and Family Services here did an evaluation of a long-term family preservation. Those were collaboratives, right? They haven't gotten the best results out of that investment. And then they brought everybody together saying, hey, you know what? We're now a learning community, so we're just going to give your data back, and now let's talk about how you're going to do better. Well, that meeting didn't go so well, right? That was a little bit of a challenge, right? It was kind of, folks were caught off guard, so it was a little bit of, the words were the right words. They had some data. The intention might have been good, but that environment, you got to be careful. Right.
It might be better just to have, say, okay, you get a stipend for being in a network weaver community of practice or something like that, where they're actually then having stuff that they're going to be trying out, and then you're building more the habit. The other one tends to be a little bit, okay, we're getting paid to sit around a table and talk, and I think that doing like a network weaver community of practice is a little bit more action oriented and specific learning oriented.
And what we found, and I would agree with that, because what I found actually, and Kara's actually going to look into this more for us, why do people keep coming when they're not paid, right? And why do they do that? And what we've found is, we have multiple ways, and we create different environments. So some of it we name community of practice, and that's, folks who are really struggling with what does this brain science mean? What is this early childhood development? We're not getting it into practice. We need to talk to each other better, and we need to really understand this. So that really, and they're not given the space. They're given tons of training, but that's not the same thing as how do I change my practice? and that reflective space. So we're finding people really appreciate that because they have the stress to do better and they don't really know what's the best way to do it. And then we have these monthly meetings that are totally different, and we ask and it could be community members come in, it can be anybody who's just, we call it a pitch, but it's not a pitch for money, it's a pitch of, you know what, I'm struggling with this problem and I'm making a pitch to ask and invite people to help me think this through. And we create that as a monthly, so we're building the culture of cooperation and learning in a purposeful way. And people come, right? The Magnolia is an unfunded, initiative. Folks are not given money to participate in it. So we have to think about what's the added value? Why would someone come? What is that space that is meaningful to people?
And you used the word vulnerability, which I think is just, profound, because trusted relationships of any kind are built on vulnerability. When you feel safe enough to be vulnerable with somebody and share things that are difficult, that's when you develop trusted relationships. And that's true. I found that to be as much true in my personal relationships as in my professional relationships. And Pat and I are both in collaboration with somebody who literally, for the first, 10 meetings I had with him, the first question might be, oh, so you were born, and then what happened? And I'm not kidding. Okay? And so the first couple of times, you know who I'm talking about. First couple of times, it's like, seriously? Do I have to do this? I guess I do. Anyway, but what happened is that by telling our stories and sharing our stories and talking about who we are and what we're bringing to the table, we developed a great amount of trust in each other, to a degree that now it's just the best collaboration I've ever been involved with. It's a cherished personal and professional relationship, and I feel like we've accomplished more together than maybe I have in any other collaboration. He doesn't ask that anymore, by the way. But that's it's kind of, and when you're in the early childhood world, everybody talks about their 0 to 5 experience. But I'm making light of it. But I think the concept of vulnerability and introducing that into one of these settings, it's kind of revolutionary, in the world that we exist in the polite sort of world of philanthropy that we all kind of exist in. And I've seen it in practice, and it's very, very powerful and really important to creating the kind of trust that then is so important to actually making a collaborative or a network work.
Okay, you had a question, then you. Okay.
I really appreciate your presentation, so thank you. I was going to ask a question about how do you know when to end, because a lot of networks are about perpetuity, and I think somebody answered it, which is you really need to be intentional in your purpose, so that's good. But I think that we all really need to lift that question over and over, because we easily forget it. My second question was about how do you incent? So you talked about the communities of practice and about learning. So that's reciprocal, and everybody is actually learning from each other. They'll come to the table. The stipend maybe is not so critical. But what about when you want the networks or the networks of networks to actually act and do something and align their work? And it's not about leading with money, but it's about leading with the work. Have any of you worked around that? I've worked in the federal government. I'm a former Casey person. So we've been trying to work across sectors, and then we talk about that and how to do it when it's not just the learning, when it's actually.
Well, I just want to tell a story about your first question. I'll let these two address the second. But I have sort of the ignominious distinction of being the person who was the president of the board when Women in Philanthropy shut down. Okay? So that was me. And, it was really hard, but what we came to understand about that collaboration, that affinity group, was that really, towards the end, we were getting together because we all really liked each other, and we wanted to see each other at board meetings. But we really weren't doing much. And the organization itself had accomplished a lot in sort of its first 20 years, right? A lot. But those last 5 years was kind of, I want to see my friends at the board meeting, you know, and we finally had that conversation and said to each other, you know, we're kind of done. We did what this organization set out to do. There are other organizations now that have sort of taken up the mantle and are doing a really good job of it. And we're just kind of getting together for our own sake and because we like each other. And we didn't think that that was a sufficient reason to keep an organization going. And so, but that was a very difficult conversation to have with ourselves, with our members, and to admit that, okay, you know, we're kind of done. Our life cycle is over. But it's critical and very important, and I still think we made the right decision.
Let me get in a few more questions.
Well, these guys,
Wait,
did you want
just
to?
a quick
Okay.
one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
There's a
gonna-
paper that Monitor did called Reamp or Transformer. You can look it up on, it's all over the internet. And it's a wonderful model of how they did system analysis, prioritization, sort of working groups. And they had a funder, several funders put money into a pot, and the decisions were made by funders and the activist groups as peers on a committee. So it's just a real concrete model. But I think that idea that you're giving money to projects, not to organizations, is also pretty important.
Well, and what I would say is no matter what, what network people are in, you know, if they're an organization, they're also part of their sector, they're part, so, you know, Magnolia's 70+ partners, it's total cross-sector, right? It's early childhood, it's health, it's schools, it's, you know, faith-based, it's mental health, you know, you name it, you know, Child Nature Institute, right? So the incentive isn't one incentive to any one. The incentives has to be what is the value added and what are the pressures that that organization lives with and lives within. I mean, the county is one of the key partners, and their pressure is numbers, 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 you know, and yet they're trying to innovate and be a whole different way that they organize and function as a county, but they still have to meet those numbers. So that pressure is there. So part of it is being transparent and having the group be able to say their stressors to the rest, even, you know, and to say what part can the network as a whole support and contribute to, and what can they just say, wow, sorry, you know, like that's really rough, but that's the reality, because that means, and that reality is whether they can actually align and coordinate with you in any meaningful way, right? When they're under so many, we were doing this amazing thing, right? Early developmental index, kindergarten teachers do it, kindergarten teachers even get a stipend, and that's the data that we get that we actually can map around how kids are doing in that at 5 throughout. We could pay for them, we could pay for their release time. For the life of them, they could not get it. They had too many pressures, too many other things going on. You couldn't make it. You couldn't incentivize it to make it worth the pressure and get them out of the pressure they were in. You had to actually go upstream and say, what's the system pressures? What is the system these folks actually work within? And who and how in the network has to try to negotiate it from a different place. So there isn't an answer to that, but I totally agree. And this is why Magnolia is a little bit different. It's kind of functioning as a system within Magnolia. Groups collectivize in different collaboratives, they do different things, and we're constantly trying to tell people, are you done, right? Like, don't you think, like, you might be done with that, could you do that? Like, because once people get into it, they don't want to let it go, and it's like, but that didn't actually result in what you wanted. Do you think we could let that go? But we're human, right? We get into something and we think that's the answer, and it's hard for us to stop and let things go, even when they know they're not working.
The other really important point about the cross-sector work is that in most cases, again, with the issues that we're all engaged with, the only real sustainability for the good outcome or for the intervention is a policy one. You know, it's a policy fix, it's a systems fix, it's a systems change, it's a systems reform. And so, you know, you have to have the advocacy or the public policy component in order to sustain those outcomes. And really, I've never seen it successfully done without a cross-sector collaborative. I just haven't.
That's a good point. Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. Go ahead.
A lot of the examples that discussed so far, I think, have been more toward service providers. And I'd be interested to hear your ideas that you may have or opportunities you see specifically with respect to the philanthropic sector and specifically with respect to Los Angeles. To, you know, whether it's applying some of the tools or practices or, you know, whatever it is that could translate, because as Gwen mentioned early on, like we talk about it a lot, and certainly there are some examples, but there are a lot more. So,
Good.
Well, I mean, a couple things. I mean, I think that you know, you might want to think about mapping. There's a lot of people out there. So you mapping your network and mapping it by not just a regular old map, but interests and things like that. And this one that I did for criminal justice funders, when they mapped, they saw that first of all they had a very thin network. You know, so that, oh, shock. And then that all the family and community funds were on the outside. They weren't connected to the national folks, so they weren't learning. They weren't learning about best practice, whatever. So, you know, even by mapping, you can do very simple fixes. And then you can begin to cluster based on interest. But I can't stress enough, if philanthropy doesn't walk the talk, by mapping their own organizations, thinking about everything that you're doing as a collaborative, a part of a network, that your learning needs to be collaborative, your strategy development needs to be collaborative. Let's, you know, there's this wonderful young guy who's developing software that enables you to both map systems where everybody can get in and map the system and what's impacting it, and then map the relationships. And those are the kinds of things that I see that funders need to be doing more of, and it could make a huge difference. But if you can't see yourself as network weavers and learn some of those skills and, you know, understand how to be a peer in some settings, of course you have that money and that's tremendous power. But that doesn't mean that every minute of your life has to be, hold yourself back because you don't want to abuse your power. You have to learn how and where you can be a peer.
So I would say that in LA there have been some really awesome donor collaboratives. So LA Urban Funders, which of course Jan was so involved with, the Homeless Collaborative, you know, the Getty did their piece last year that brought us worldwide recognition for art in Los Angeles. You know, I think there have been some great collaboratives. I think actually one of the issues in the LA philanthropic world that we have to grapple with is leadership, you know, as a community. When I moved to LA in 1986, we had major corporate philanthropy here. We had ARCO, we had Times Mirror, we had Security Pacific Bank. And there was a real sense of, with the private philanthropy, the corporate, the family, you know, that we had a voice at the civic table, that we had influence in civil society in the city. And I don't really feel that so much anymore. I feel like we do great work together a lot. I think we do collaborate well. But I don't feel that we influence the issues of the day in Los Angeles. And I'm looking at Nikki because she might want to push back at me about that a little bit. But I think it's more a leadership issue, actually. I'd be curious to hear your point of view. But Jan, you've been trying to say something.
Well, that's what I wanted to hear, a little more on some models for how funders do play a role, because you have talked a lot about service providers. But what are some of the models that you've learned where funders come in unobtrusively, carrying money, but playing whatever the equal role is, and also keeping in mind funders may be involved, the same funder may be involved in a half dozen different collaboratives.
Absolutely.
You're in the collaborative that's your whole life, but the funder may be bringing some money and some talent, but they're going to parachute in. So how do you integrate that? I mean, what are some models that you've found that work well?
Well, I think that REAMP model is really worth looking at because you're not parachuting in. They're part of the process from the beginning, but
That
as
was worst case scenario.
but as peers and really, you know, part of that process and just an equal part as a decision maker. And, you know, I mean, I think that's just one that you can access pretty easily.
I'm supported by Philanthropy. I'm not affiliated with any of the organizations, and I've been supported by Philanthropy through the process of Magnolia and also through the South LA Child Welfare Initiative, which was a consortium of funders who put money together to seed some innovation and some learning in South LA, where they let the community, through community dialogues, decide the issue, which was child welfare. But so I think Gwen's right, there's multiple iterations and prototyping of how funders come together, how do they think together, how do they align some of their interests, how can a smaller group of funders create a space for some of the innovation of learning, so like in the South LA scenario. So a couple of the more family foundations who could deal with the risk of the innovation did the first couple years, and then you have Keck coming in who can then be more substantial. You know, so there's ways to think about it, and not so much as you might parachute in at this moment, but how might that be a collective endeavor based on the type of role of investments that you actually make. Because if we're going to get to change in these entrenched problems, it's long term, and it's pretty, it's pretty contrary to the way that most of you are structured to just say, oh, okay, I'm 20 years, I'm in this, let's just see what happens over 20 years. But there's different benchmarking of different iterations of where folks are trying to move and what they're trying to accomplish. But that does require a different level of conversation among the funders and honesty, right, around, well, what really is being learned, is that really an innovation, or do we say, no, let's not bring other funding, where those are, I'm not saying, but those have been tried out. It was that same group that did the South LA, they did the WIN project in the West Side, which was a collective group, and that's blossomed enormously, right, into a very interesting cross-sector endeavor and investment. So I think the models are out there, but again, they're happening in small little pockets. So where does the learning and the sharing actually occur within your own community?
And I want to clarify something too. I know we talked about sort of community level change and service providers, but the context for me in that is that funders are at those tables, okay, in a way that they haven't been before. And so I don't want the takeaway to be, oh, they talked too much about service providers. Actually, I think more than ever now, being a program officer is being a community organizer. And you have to, that's the way that you have to think. It's a different skill set than doing your desktop due diligence and reading your proposals. And no, you got to go to community meetings, you got to testify at commission meetings, you got to be at those tables talking to the moms. It's a really different job than it used to be. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And we don't train to it, we don't hire to it. But that's what the expectation is. And when you talk about networks and collaborations, that's actually what it takes to make it work. It's that on the ground, I know what's going on here, I got it, I know the players, I know I can sniff it out. You're a partner. You're not just a partner with other funders, you're a partner with the community.
One of the structures that we did, because I think it's very different too, when it came to policy and thinking about, because it's not Magnolia as a service network, it really isn't. It's Magnolia as a learning system. So when it actually is the policy group, there are funders literally sitting around trying to say, what are you all learning? Where does this place, right? So I'm giving the wrong impression if you're thinking that it's just the service network. It's and those funders aren't necessarily even the funders that are directly supporting any piece. They support people, like you said, they support people in iterations, but it's, wait, if we're actually going to get to policy issues, we have to think about what is being learned, what are the policy implications, who could help and actually be in a dialogue around that conversation, right? And funders sit at that table, business, Chamber of Commerce community, to just say, well, are we getting enough out of this that it's worth a policy conversation? Or what would it take to make this a policy conversation? So it's a very different role, a very different role.
Okay, I want to
All right.
thank all the panelists. You guys do. There's so much more that we could still talk about. And I think
We'll
June
be here for a
and
reception,
Gwen
yeah.
and Pat. So thank
you,
them very
everybody.
much.